Hello everyone, I'm really excited to share with you my personal picks for the top 20 bosses in the Dark Souls trilogy. Before we jump in, I just want to explain exactly what this list is about. Firstly, why only Dark Souls bosses? Why not the rest of From Software's library? Well, the reason is simple. I haven't played Demon Souls or Elden Ring yet, and whilst I have played both Sekiro and Bloodborne, I never played the Bloodborne DLC, and I never beat the Shura ending in Sekiro. In contrast, I've beaten every boss in all three Dark Souls games, so I've experienced everything that these three games have to offer in terms of bosses. Additionally, I'd like to add that this list is based on a singular playthrough of all three of these games. I recently played all three back to back for the first time, so all these bosses are still fresh in my mind. Some of you might be wondering why I make this video only after playing each game once, as some bosses will become less of a challenge on reruns, but I wanted to make this video after one playthrough as I think it will make this list more interesting, as there are definitely a few shocks in store for Souls players on my list. I also want to clarify that this is the top 20 best bosses, not top 20 hardest bosses, or top 20 best mechanically designed or something like that. These are the top 20 bosses that I enjoyed fighting the most, and therefore it should go without saying that this video is all my own opinion, so don't take too much stock of it. I am an idiot. Anyway, with all that said and done, let's get into the top 20 bosses in Dark Souls. Number 20, Sir Alonne, Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin. Just about squeaking his way into my top 20 is Sir Alonne from the much maligned Dark Souls 2. I've spoken before about how I actually like Dark Souls 2, and some of you may be surprised by how much love that game gets in this video. However, even the biggest Dark Souls 2 haters seem to have a soft spot for Sir Alonne, and it's easy to see why. He has fantastic lore involving the Old Iron King, and is a good challenge for the DLC he's in. Some people may complain about the run back to this boss, but that was never a problem for me due to all the enemies in Dark Souls 2 having limited spawns. Sir Alonne is just a cool boss and fights with honour, even committing suicide if he never does any damage to you. His battle feels like an actual duel to the death, and he has some very punishing moves. However, this is partly the reason why he only comes in at number 20. There was one move in particular that Sir Alonne did that I absolutely hated, and it always seemed to connect, regardless of whether I dodged it or not. This wouldn't be a problem if not for the fact that the Alonne fight seems to drastically change depending on his RNG. I had some fights where he never did this attack, and I would always do better on these runs. Fortunately, the rest of Sir Alonne's movesets were fun for me to combat, but these frustrations in my initial playthrough are what ultimately holds Sir Alonne from being any higher on the list. Number 19, Smelter Demon, Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin. Putting the Smelter Demon above Sir Alonne is probably a very controversial decision, but hopefully I'll be able to convince you that he deserves this spot. I also want to quickly clarify that I'm talking about the red variant of the Smelter Demon, and definitely not the blue one. The blue Smelter Demon may be one of the worst bosses that From Software have put out in my opinion. The primary reason why the red Smelter Demon makes this list is because it's optional. You can tackle this boss pretty much whenever you want. Now if you choose to fight this boss in the early game, then you're most likely going to come across a very tough, very frustrating, and probably unfun boss encounter. However, you wait until the late game, which is what I would recommend, then the Smelter Demon is a much more enjoyable boss battle. Yes, I do realise that I'm suggesting that making a boss easier in a game series famous for being a challenge is what gets this boss on the list, but as I made clear in the intro for this video, this is not the top 20 hardest bosses in Dark Souls, but the top 20 best. A boss being more difficult won't necessarily secure it a place on this list. One of my favourite From Software bosses is the Divine Dragon in Sekiro, and that boss is super easy. What's great is that the Smelter Demon is still capable of killing you late in the game, with his varied moveset and the fact that just being near him will do you damage. The Smelter Demon isn't the most complex boss in Dark Souls, but he is a fun boss in my opinion. Plus, if you really don't like him, you can just walk past his boss fight and take on the Old Iron King. Number 18, Four Kings, Dark Souls Remastered. After two Dark Souls 2 bosses, I'm sure some of you will be happy to see a boss from a different game. The Four Kings are the first boss from Dark Souls 1 to make my top 20, and there's a very simple reason for that. This boss is a race against time. Sometimes when I face a boss in these games, I get this sudden rush of adrenaline, and any boss that gives me that will get extra brownie points on this list. Neither Sir Alonne or the Smelter Demon gave me that rush, but the Four Kings did. Knowing that I had a limited amount of time to kill one of the Four Kings before the next one spawned was exhilarating. The second half of Dark Souls 1 may be weaker than the first, but the Four Kings are a bright spot in the second half. The thing that holds the Four Kings back is that they are quite easy. I beat them on my first try, and then me complaining about that contradicts how I spoke about the Smelter Demon, but there's no better feeling in these games than defeating a boss that gave you so much trouble. The Four Kings are an excellent boss, but they're just not as good as the upcoming bosses on this list, at least in my opinion. Number 17, Manus, Father of the Abyss, Dark Souls Remastered. Continuing with Dark Souls, we have the next boss in my top 20, Manus, Father of the Abyss. This may come as a surprise, but I wasn't actually sure whether I was going to include Manus on this list. Not because I think he's a bad boss, but because when I fought him, I beat him on my first try. Again, this doesn't automatically ruin a boss, but after having died so many times to both Artorias and Kalameet, beating Manus on my first try was a bit of a letdown. Now, unlike the Four Kings, I don't think Manus is easy. The reason I beat Manus was purely due to my shield-focused playstyle, but he did come close to killing me a few times when I fought him, and he boasts arguably the most aggressive moveset in the entire first game. Plus, I love that he's very influential on the lore going forward in the next 2 games. Manus might not be my favourite boss or pose as much of a challenge to me as he would anyone who fought him with a different playstyle, but he is an excellent boss and deserves to be on the list. Number 16, Nameless King, Dark Souls 3. This will be the first of many controversial placements on this list. Nameless King is one of the most popular bosses from Dark Souls 3, is often heralded as the hardest boss in the base game. And yeah, he probably is the hardest boss in the base game of Dark Souls 3, with only Dancer being a boss that I might consider being harder. Some of you might be thinking that I put him so low due to his King of the Storm phase, but that isn't the reason. I actually really liked the King of the Storm phase this fight. Yeah, the camera will likely get you killed on your first few attempts, but once you adjust to it, you probably won't have much of an issue with this phase. Plus, I think it's so cool watching him glide down on a dragon that is clearly one of his supporters that was able to undergo the transformation into a dragon. The real reason people love this boss is the second phase when you take on the Nameless King himself. I have to be honest, I don't love this phase as much as everyone else. This is completely due to playstyle, but Nameless was just a little too aggressive for me and I had trouble reading his moves. This isn't a knock against the boss, just me explaining why I personally didn't love it as much as the 15 bosses that I ranked higher than it. However, the Nameless King boss had one of the strangest runs I've ever done. In the second phase, I got the king to about 60% health and I had about 4 Estus left. I thought I was done for. Then suddenly, everything clicked. I knew which attacks to wait for and punish, and I knew when not to be greedy. I was patient with this boss, and I ultimately defeated it with those 4 Estus flasks not being used. Unfortunately, going slow with this boss also ruined my enjoyment a little, and I didn't receive the same adrenaline rush fighting this boss as I did the Four Kings. However, this is objectively a great boss, and one I do look forward to fighting again. Number 15, Soul of Cinder, Dark Souls 3. If there's one thing that I found disappointing about Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, then it would be the final boss of those games. I know Gwyn is quite popular, but as someone who had faced both Ishin and Gehrman before taking on Gwyn, he was quite a disappointment, and the Chandra from Dark Souls 2 was just a crap boss in my opinion. I do like Aldia, but he doesn't hold a candle to Ishin or Gehrman. Fortunately, Dark Souls 3 knew how to step up its game and gave me the Soul of Cinder, which is easily the best final boss of any Dark Souls game. Just the arena you fight in is breathtaking, and the plethora of moves that the Soul of Cinder pulls out to slay you is amazing. This boss uses every move that any player has used in the game against you. It's fantastic in the second phase where he switches to a better version of the Gwyn fight, with even Gwyn's plimplons playing in the background, was awesome. However, the reason Soul of Cinder doesn't reach any higher on the list is due to the RNG of his first phase, where certain modes, such as the Mage one, are a cakewalk to fight, and other modes are just a nightmare to deal with. I also like his second phase less than the first one, but I still enjoyed it. Obviously, it is my 15th favourite fight in all of Dark Souls. The point is, Soul of Cinder is a great boss and a great end to the base game of Dark Souls 3. Number 14, Fume Knight, Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin. I'd heard so much about how challenging the Fume Knight was, and how he's one of the hardest bosses from software I've ever put out, and honestly, I don't think he's that bad. Yeah, he is difficult, but his difficulty doesn't live up to the hype. As long as you use the Smelter wedges on the arena around the Fume Knight, then you should be able to take him down. The Fume Knight is another boss with great lore, and I enjoy his moveset. He has these long, sweeping attacks that can punish players who think they are in a safe area to attack, and you only need to get hit twice by the Fume Knight's massive black sword to be taken out of commission. I think the Fume Knight is a fun boss because there are opportunities to both attack and heal in this boss battle. It's not one of those bosses where you get destroyed and you scream out loud, "When can I heal?" And yet the Fume Knight can still eviscerate your health bar. He's not that complex of a boss fight, but his interesting lore and high damage output make this a fun boss in my book, and him alongside Sir Alonne are the reason why I think the Crown of the Old Iron King is the best out of the 3 Dark Souls 2 DLCs. Number 13, The Pursuer, Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin. If you needed any more proof that it's not the difficulty of a boss that makes me personally enjoy them, then look no further than the Pursuer in Dark Souls 2. The Pursuer is one of the first bosses that you will face in Dark Souls 2, and has thus become the poster child for the game. The Pursuer is by no means difficult unless you've died so many times on the way to him that your health bar has now been halved by the stupid Dark Souls 2 rules. He's just a cool boss, he has a great design, and I like that you can use the ballistas behind him to take out a huge chunk of his health should you dare. Considering Dark Souls 2 is often spat on by the community, the Pursuer seems to be a boss that everyone looks back on fondly, and I think it's because he's well balanced for an early game challenge. You should be able to beat him because his movesets aren't the most complex, but if you're new to Souls games or have half health because you refuse to use human effigies, you may find the Pursuer a challenging fight, and even if you are accustomed to these games, the Pursuer can still take you down if you're not careful. Usually, early game bosses are often forgotten by players when it comes to discussing the best bosses in these types of games, but the Pursuer was able to do enough to make sure that you'd remember him. Number 12, Champion Gundyr, Dark Souls 3. Nobody likes reskin bosses. They almost always have the same moveset with only the slightest of variations and feel like they're put in the game just so that there are enough bosses in the game that people don't get mad, which ends up causing people to get mad when they have to fight these crappy reskins. Champion Gundyr is proof that a boss reskin can be done really well. First of all, due to the law of Dark Souls 3, it makes sense that you're fighting Gundyr again. Unfortunately, From Software made sure to give this Gundyr a noticeably different moveset to the one that he had at the start of the game. I like that it genuinely feels like you were fighting a warrior in their prime, whereas the Gundyr at the start of the game was clearly well worn out. Champion Gundyr has some of the most aggressive moves in the game and is unrelenting in his attack. I said earlier that the Four Kings gave me a sense of adrenaline when I fought them, and the same is true for Gundyr here. He punishes any error in your attack and will take advantage of any mistake that you make. He's one of the most fun bosses in the base Dark Souls 3 game and was able to surpass the reskin curse of the previous Dark Souls games. Number 11, Darklurker, Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin. Just missing out on the top 10 is Darklurker from Dark Souls 2. It's a bit of a headache trying to find this boss, to the point where I often see this labelled as a secret boss instead of an optional one. Fortunately, all the annoying stuff you have to do is ultimately worth it, as Darklurker is the best boss in the base game of Dark Souls 2. The Darklurker boss fight is ultimately one of two halves. The first half of the fight is shockingly easy. It is so easy that I genuinely think I could do it with my eyes closed. I would always come out of the first half of this fight without even a single scratch on me. However, things get ramped up several notches during the second half when Darklurker splits in two. The second half of the fight is no longer fight. It's just you running around in circles like a headless chicken trying to survive all the attacks that both Darklurkers send hurtling your way. This second half is one of the most challenging things that I've ever had to deal with in any From Software game, as Darklurker does massive damage. You can easily lose all your health in the blink of an eye. Darklurker is one of those bosses where we killed each other. However, unlike what usually happens in these games where that still counts as a victory, it didn't against Darklurker, and I had to keep fighting him until I finally vanquished him. Beating Darklurker was one of the best moments I had when playing Dark Souls 2 and was a great end to a great game. Number 10, Darkeater Midir, Dark Souls 3. Darkeater Midir is one of, if not the most divisive boss in all of Dark Souls, and you know what, I completely get it. In fact, I initially hated this boss. Every attempt was just a frustrating experience that I wanted to end. If I hadn't sworn to beat every boss in these games, then I'd have probably left Darkeater Midir alone, because I just really didn't enjoy fighting him. So now you're thinking, if you didn't enjoy fighting him, how come he's in your top 10 Dark Souls bosses? And the reason is shockingly simple. It's the visceral attack. This one move completely flipped my opinion on this boss. Up until that point, fighting Midir felt like a chore. His health bar was so big that even though I was doing over 300 damage to his head, it still felt like I was just slowly chipping away at him. But then, on this one fateful attempt, I smacked him right in the head and he reels back and places his head on the ground. I then sprint over to him with a new sense of urgency that had been missing from the rest of the fight, and I get the visceral. The best part about the visceral on Midir is that it did so much damage to him. I literally think I only had to hit his head 4 or 5 more times to take him down. That one visceral attack turned my frustrations into enjoyment, and I got that adrenaline rush slaying Midir just like when I took down the Four Kings. Number 9, Demon in Pain and Demon from Below / Demon Prince, Dark Souls 3. If there's one type of boss fight that I hate, then it would be the gank fight, or the fight against multiple bosses at once for anyone who doesn't know what gank means. It's the primary reason why the Four Kings battle filled me with so much adrenaline, as I just knew that I would completely fall apart if I had to deal with any more than one king at a time. The main reasons why I don't like gank fights is because I just struggle to keep notice of both bosses, and it usually leads to me panicking and then just messing everything up. However, the other problem with gank boss battles in Dark Souls is that they usually just suck. They're either way too easy or they are so imbalanced that they become frustrating. The Demon in Pain and the Demon from Below are neither of these. They are perfectly balanced. One of them will usually hand back whilst the other is attacking and try and hit you with its poison breath. Then it will eventually charge up and go on the attack. When it does this, the other demon will then take a step back and start trying to poison you. This makes it significantly easier to keep an eye on both bosses and prevents the player from feeling like they're being overwhelmed. I also like that the second phase of this boss battle is different depending on which demon you killed first. If you want to make life a little easier for yourself, then make sure to kill the Demon in Pain first, as the souped up demon from below is basically just a more powerful version of the first phase, but with just one demon instead of 2. If you like the idea of masochism, then be sure to kill the demon from below first. The thing that holds this boss back for me from getting any higher is that I don't think it's particularly difficult. It's definitely not easy, but it took me 3 attempts to beat this boss, and the reason I died the second time is because I killed the wrong demon first. Another reason why it doesn't get any higher is because I think this boss was overshadowed by the other bosses in the DLC. However, it beats Midir due to overall being a fight lacking frustration and just being fun. I'm a man who hates multiple bosses in a boss fight, and even I like this fight. Number 8, Ornstein and Smough, Dark Souls Remastered. However, if there's one boss that arguably perfected the idea of a gank battle, they would undoubtedly be Ornstein and Smough. From this point on, I believe we get to the creme de la creme of Dark Souls bosses. Everything else in the top 20 is what I consider to be A tier. Going forward, we're only dealing with S tier bosses, when the only reason why one boss edges out another is due to purely minor reasons. Ornstein and Smough are arguably the most iconic bosses that From Software have ever made, and they're so popular that From Software have tried to recapture that same magic time and time again. They came very close in my opinion with the Demon Prince boss, but just fell a little short of the OG. What can I say about Ornstein and Smough that hasn't already been said? Both have great movesets that are perfectly complementary. It's great that there are two completely different second phases that encourages players to give the game a second playthrough. And the boss theme is so powerful that it triggers flashbacks anytime I hear it. What isn't to love about this boss? Well, actually a few things if I'm being honest. Firstly, the first phase of the fight can be a little slow, and Ornstein can sometimes unleash a dash move that seems to zip around the arena in at times very weird directions, especially if you're standing behind a pillar. I also really don't like Smough's second phase. Perhaps I was just unlucky with my RNG, but he kept repeatedly doing his electric slam move, and I mean repeatedly. He'd jump in the air, slam and electrify me, then get to his feet, then jump in the air again, slam and electrify me. There was little opportunity to heal. These aren't major issues, and I do really love the first phase, but these minor problems are what ultimately keeps this boss from getting any higher on the list. Number 7, Slave Knight Gael, Dark Souls 3. I'm sure I'll get a lot of flack for having Slave Knight Gael so low down on my list, as he seems to be most people's number 1 favourite Dark Souls boss, and perhaps after multiple playthroughs, he'll end up being my number 1 too. Unfortunately, the reason why Gael doesn't get any higher on my list is for a very similar reason to what held Manus back. No, I didn't beat Gael in one attempt. I beat him in 2, and that's it. The reason why Gael doesn't get any higher on my list is because I didn't spend as much time with him as I did the majority of bosses on this list, and yet Gael is such a great boss that he was still able to stick out in my memory despite me quickly dispatching of him. I said before that I beat every boss in Dark Souls 1 and 2 bar 1 by constantly hiding behind my shield and tanking the hits. Dark Souls 3 was a different story, and I couldn't do that for the majority of bosses. However, Gael was different, and I was able to best him using the shield strategy. Fortunately, Gael has fantastic design, brilliant voice acting, and a beautiful score. Whilst Gael didn't deliver on the difficulty for me that I was expecting, he certainly delivered on the spectacle, and was a great end to what might be the best DLC in all of Dark Souls. I look forward to taking on Gael again, and I wouldn't be surprised if my opinion on Gael is the one that changed the most as I spend even more time with him. Number 6, Sister Friede and Father Arlandel, Dark Souls 3. If there was one DLC boss in Dark Souls 3 that lives up to the hype in terms of both difficulty and spectacle, then it would have to be Sister Friede and Father Arlandel. This is the only 3-phase boss fight in this series, and therefore becomes a test of endurance as you do everything in your power to last against Friede. Her first phase isn't particularly difficult as you can easily stagger her, and once you figure out her invisible attack, you should be able to make short work of this phase. The second phase is where things get tough as you have to deal with another From Software gank fight. Fortunately, this one is pretty well balanced too. It can definitely get more hectic than both the Demon Princes and the Ornstein and Smough fight, and at times you may get overwhelmed, but From Software did a good job making this phase feel fair, as Friede is a lot less aggressive in this phase. That doesn't mean she just sits back and picks her nails with a scythe. No, it means that her attacks are usually more supportive of Father Arlandel's attacks, and can do tons of damage if you don't keep an eye on the ground beneath your feet. Fortunately, it's very easy to dodge Father Arlandel's attacks, and Friede will often leave himself wide open for backstabs as she tries to heal Father Arlandel. Once this phase is over, you don't have to deal with the Black Frame Friede phase. This phase is basically a more aggressive, higher damage version of the first phase, and is ultimately what secured this boss a place so high up on my list. The Ashes of Arlandel DLC gets a lot of flack for being very short, but at least From Software put their heart and soul into this one aspect of the DLC. This boss fight is also one of the closest fights that I've ever had in Dark Souls, as both me and Black Flame Friede were one hit away from death. I had no Estus, and just as I thought I had messed up, my sword slashes into her and she falls to the ground. What a battle. Easily my favourite Dark Souls 3 DLC boss. Number 5, Abysswalkers, Dark Souls 3. Just beating Sister Friede and Father Arlandel to my top 5 is the Abysswalkers. Everyone likes this boss. They are without a doubt the best early boss that From Software have ever made, except for maybe Gascoigne, but this is a Dark Souls boss list and Bloodborne has no place here. The first part of the Abysswalkers is my favourite gank fight in any game. You have to take on 2 Abysswalkers whilst another comes to your aid. Or does he? In fact, the red-eyed Abysswalker just wants to kill anything in his path, and that includes you if you get too close to him. I like that this phase feels like a more exciting version of Ornstein and Smough's first phase, and because it's easier, it doesn't drag out as long as Ornstein and Smough. And then there's the second phase, which is just awesome. Watching the fired-up Abysswalker just fly through the air towards me and slide across the floor, leaving a trail of fire behind him, was just so cool. This battle just feels like From Software cherry-picked the best aspects of other boss battles and shook it together to create an all-new, interesting cocktail. I essentially have no negatives against this boss battle, other than the Abyss Watchers may have too little health, but I might also be thinking that because I didn't want this boss battle to end. Number 4, Black Dragon Kalameet, Dark Souls Remastered. One thing that I've realised after playing all 3 Dark Souls games, Bloodborne and Sekiro, is that for the most part I prefer fighting humanoid bosses to beast type bosses. Black Dragon Kalameet is the beast type boss that managed to get past this preference of mine and is my favourite dragon boss in the series. From Software have taken many cracks at making dragon bosses, but I don't think that they ever did it better than Kalameet. He's probably what I would consider to be the hardest boss in Dark Souls 1, and he's very punishing. I'm not really aware of his lore, but he does have one of the best cutscenes in all Souls, where a giant with a bow one-shots him out of the sky. Time and time again, I fought this boss and each time he would best me. I'd learn his moveset, and yet those exact same moves would still kill me. There was a point where I felt like I would never beat Kalameet, and then eventually I did. Slaying this beast was one of the most satisfying victories I achieved in Dark Souls 1, but I wouldn't be lying if I said part of me was dreading taking him on again. However, another part of me is salivating at the thought of killing him again, and I can't wait to do just that. Number 3, Lothric and Lorien, Twin Princes, Dark Souls 3. Snatching the bronze medal away from Kalameet is my favourite boss in Dark Souls 3. I know this is a popular boss, but I'm sure most of you will be surprised to see Lothric and Lorien get so high up on my list. The reason why they are here is simple. They're a boss that is perfect for my shield strategy. However, unlike Midir and Gael, it took me several attempts to beat these two, and the reason is because they're constant teleporting. This mechanic felt like a direct response to my playstyle. Can't hide behind my shield if the boss teleports behind me. His attacks were aggressive, but there was ample opportunity to attack on heal, and this boss can easily punish you if you're not careful. Some people may say that this boss should be knocked down a few places due to the camera occasionally locking off when Lorien teleports, but I don't think that this is a major problem. The lock-on does a good job of keeping track of Lorien, and when it does lock off, it's because Lorien has teleported far enough away to do his magic downward slash attack, which lasts long enough for you to get him back in your sights. However, the main reason why Lothric and Lorien get so high up on my list is because they gave me that same adrenaline rush that the Four Kings, Champion Gundyr, and the Abyss Watchers gave me. I love this fight and it is so unique compared to everything else in the series. Number 2, Burnt Ivory King, Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin. However, there is no boss fight more unique in this series than that of the Burnt Ivory King. I'm sure pretty much everyone is surprised to see a Dark Souls 2 boss claiming the silver on my list, but I just absolutely adore this battle. It's important that you're aware that it's not just the actual fight with the Ivory King himself, but also the fight against the Charred Loist Knights and the setup you need to undergo to face this boss. Before even thinking of fighting the Burnt Ivory King, you need to collect 4 good Loist Knights to help you in your battle, otherwise this fight will be a pain in the bum. Once they're all collected, you then drop down into the fiery pits of chaos and battle against the Charred Loist Knights with your bros. Once they have been defeated and 3 of the uncorrupted Loist Knights have sacrificed themselves to shut the portals, the Burnt Ivory King will reveal himself. After having one of the coolest entrances in Dark Souls, the Burnt Ivory King will quickly tear the final good Loist Knight apart before kicking your ass. I said before that I used my shield strategy to best every boss in Dark Souls 1 and 2. The Burnt Ivory King is the one boss where my shield strategy did not work. When he powers up his sword, my shield would just crumble and he'd have beaten me in a few seconds. I had to fat roll my way through this guy's attacks until I finally slayed him. It's not just the uniqueness of the boss that I enjoy, but also his lore. The Burnt Ivory King is a true hero who sacrificed himself to protect his kingdom, and his wife is like the only good wife in Dark Souls 2 that didn't try and ruin his life. This boss is so cool, and I think after hearing me explain why I love this boss so much, my number 1 pick won't be in any way surprising. But before we say my number 1 favourite boss in Dark Souls, here are some honourable mentions. The Battle Gargoyles from Dark Souls 1. This boss was the first wall I faced in Dark Souls 1, and they have an amazing score. It's no surprise that From Software tried to replicate this boss in Dark Souls 2. The Battlefield Gargoyles from Dark Souls 2. People hate this boss, but I love this boss for the same reason as Smelter Demon. Coming back to this boss after it kicked my butt in the early game was so much fun and a very memorable experience. The Afflicted Grave Robber, Ancient Soldier Varg, and Sarah the Old Explorer, also known as the Gang Squad from Dark Souls 2. The arena makes this fight work as you have to balance taking on 3 enemies, and there are multiple places for you to hide from the archer, who was the biggest issue for me. The Duke's Deer Frere from Dark Souls 2. This is basically the ROM fight from Bloodborne, but good. Demon of Song from Dark Souls 2. This boss sucks if I'm being honest, but I really like its art design. Curse Rite Greatwood from Dark Souls 3. People hate this boss, but I have to admit I enjoy popping its testicles. Champions Gravetender and Gratender Greatwolf from Dark Souls 3. Another unpopular boss, but I enjoy just wiping the floor with this boss. Now that the honourable mentions are out of the way, let's talk about my favourite boss in the Dark Souls series. Number 1, Artorias the Abysswalker, Dark Souls Remastered. That's right, my top 20 may have had some shocks and surprises, but my number 1 pick ultimately ended up being a pretty conventional choice. Artorias is just perfect. Great boss battle, great challenge, best lore of any boss, great score. Sad ending when you go back to his arena and see his wife has made a grave for him. He even took good care of his doggy. Artorias was also able to give me that adrenaline rush that I love so much, as he has a power-up move that can be stopped if you do enough damage to him. This one move brought so much urgency to the fight and made it so much more stressful. Anytime I failed to stop this power-up, Artorias would kill me, and the best part about this power-up is that he does it several times throughout the fight, meaning that you have to stay on your toes if you want any chance of beating him. Then there's just all the cool information outside the fight, like the fact Artorias is based on Guts and Berserk, or how Artorias is actually left-handed but his left arm is bust, so he's forced to fight you with his right, or how his final act before being corrupted was same as Dark Sith. Everything about him is so awesome. He's so cool they even named the DLC after him. He's also just a unique boss. There's no humanoid boss that reminds me of Artorias' moveset. Maybe the Soul of Cinder, but the Soul of Cinder is an amalgamation of every playstyle, so that's no real surprise. Artorias is just what you get when every aspect of a boss is 10 out of 10, and I have no faults with this boss. This is one of the bosses where it feels like an unquestionably good thing to put him out of his misery. Whilst Artorias may have a bit of competition when it comes to my favourite From Software boss, since I love Sekiro so much, Artorias is undoubtedly my favourite boss in all of Dark Souls. Now that I've told you my favourite Dark Souls bosses, let me know what your favourites are in the comments below. Tell me which bosses should have made my list and which placements were the most surprising. This is a very different video compared to what I usually do on this channel, and I hope you enjoyed it. Anyway, that's all for today. Bye bye.